He saved one lost child from the desert. By dawn, 100 warriors surrounded his ranch demanding answers. The sun hung merciless over the New Mexico territory, its heat shimmering off the parched earth like ghostly dancers. Calder Boone wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he checked the water troughs near his livestock pens, the wooden planks creaking under the weight of his boots. At 43, he had learned to read the desert's moods, the way the wind carried stories of dust storms days before they arrived, how the cattle bunched together when Apache raiders moved through the distant mesas. Today, something felt different. The silence stretched too thin, broken only by the occasional lowing of his longhorns and the whisper of wind through the sage brush. It was then he saw her. A small figure stumbled between the mesquite trees, no bigger than a shadow against the vastness of the high desert. Calder's hand instinctively moved to the colt at his hip, then stopped. The figure swayed, caught herself, and continued forward with the determination of someone who had already traveled too far to turn back. As she drew closer, Calder's breath caught. She was a child, no more than 9 years old, her dark hair matted with dust and debris. Her skin, bronzed by heritage and burned by the relentless sun, bore the telltale signs of someone who had wandered the desert for days. Her small feet, wrapped in torn moccasins that had seen better months, left barely visible prints in the hard-pan soil. "Easy there, little one," Calder called softly, approaching with the same care he'd used with a spooked Mustang. The girl's dark eyes, wide with exhaustion and weariness, tracked his movement. When she stumbled again, he caught her before she could fall, feeling how light she was, too light for a child her age. Without hesitation, he lifted her onto his horse, a steady bay mare named Patience. The girl didn't resist, though her small hands gripped the saddle horn with surprising strength. As they rode toward his modest ranch house, Calder noticed details that made his chest tighten with concern. Her clothes, though well-made in the traditional style of the Tahuea people, were torn and stained with travel. More telling was the way she held herself, alert despite her exhaustion, watching the horizon as if expecting pursuit. The ranch house stood like a weathered sentinel against the endless sky, its adobe walls thick enough to keep out the worst of the desert heat. Calder had built it himself after the war, when he'd come west seeking something he couldn't name. Solitude, perhaps, or maybe just distance from the memories that haunted the green hills of Missouri. Inside, the house retained the cool of early morning. Calder settled the girl on his only chair, noting how she positioned herself with a clear view of both the door and the single window. Smart child, the desert taught hard lessons about survival, and she'd clearly learned them well. "You hungry?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Her hollow cheeks and the way her eyes followed his movement toward the kitchen told him everything he needed to know. He set beans to simmer on the cast-iron stove, the same stove that had cooked countless solitary meals over the past 15 years. While they bubbled, he mixed cornbread batter with practiced efficiency, all the while keeping one eye on his unexpected guest. She sat perfectly still, but he could sense her cataloging every detail of his home. The rifle mounted above the fireplace, the water bucket by the door, the spare boots that might fit someone in a hurry to leave. When he set the bowl of beans and chunk of golden cornbread before her, she ate with the focused intensity of someone who didn't know when the next meal might come. Calder had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers during the lean months of the war. It was the look of someone who had learned not to take sustenance for granted. As she ate, he noticed the pendant around her neck, a piece of carved bone that caught the lamplight with each movement. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of work that spoke of generations of skilled hands. More importantly, he recognized the symbols etched into its surface. Years of trading with various tribes had taught him to read the subtle languages of their artifacts. This wasn't just jewelry, it was a marker of lineage, of blood ties to leadership. His stomach dropped as the implications settled over him like a heavy blanket. The tensions between the Tahuea nation and the growing number of settlers had been escalating for months. Cattle had gone missing, water rights were disputed, and more than one homestead had been abandoned after mysterious fires. If this child was who he suspected she might be, her presence on his land could be seen as an act of aggression, or worse, kidnapping. The girl finished eating and looked up at him with eyes that held far too much wisdom for someone her age. She spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper, in the liquid syllables of the Tahuea language. Though Calder couldn't understand the words, he heard the exhaustion in them, the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "You're safe here," he said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "Nobody's going to hurt you." She studied his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read truth in the expressions of strangers. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded once and allowed him to lead her to his own bed. He tucked her under the heavy wool blanket his mother had made decades ago, watching as sleep claimed her almost instantly. That night, Calder sat in his chair by the window, his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness for movement. He'd sent up a prayer to a God he wasn't sure was listening, asking for guidance in a situation that seemed to have no good outcomes. If he was right about the girl's identity, keeping her could mean war, but sending her back into the desert in her condition would be tantamount to murder. Dawn came with the sound of horses. Calder counted at least 6 riders approaching from the east, their silhouettes dark against the brightening sky. He recognized the lead rider before they drew close enough to make out faces: Marshal Everett Lang, a man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his determination to keep the peace in this volatile territory. "Calder," Lang called out as he dismounted, his weathered face grim. "We need to talk." The other riders were local ranchers, men Calder knew by sight if not by name. Their faces bore the tight expressions of people who had ridden hard with bad news. Tom Hendricks, whose spread lay 20 miles to the north, couldn't quite meet Calder's eyes. Jake Morrison, whose wife had been sending preserves and baked goods to Calder's doorstep for the past 3 years, looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. "What brings you out this way, Marshal?" Calder asked, though he suspected he already knew. Lang removed his hat, running his fingers through graying hair. "Red Elk's daughter went missing 3 days ago. Little Star, they call her. The Tahué are saying she was taken." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Calder felt the weight of every gaze upon him, measuring his reaction. These were good men for the most part, but fear had a way of making even good men dangerous. "That's a serious accusation," Calder said carefully. "It is." Lang's tone remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp. "Thing is, they're not just accusing, they're mobilizing. Our scouts report war parties moving in from the north and east. Could be 100 warriors, maybe more." Jake Morrison spoke up, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Calder, if you know something, anything about this girl, you need to tell us. My family, Tom's family, hell, all our families could be in danger." Calder looked from face to face, seeing the fear there, the desperate hope that he might have answers that could prevent bloodshed. The girl was still sleeping in his bed, healing from whatever ordeal had brought her to his doorstep. To turn her over now, weak as she was, would be to sign her death warrant, but to keep her might sign death warrants for dozens of others. "I found a child yesterday," he said finally, "wandering near my stock pens. She was hurt, exhausted. I gave her food and shelter. The silence that followed was broken only by the shifting of horses and the whisper of wind through the sage." Marshal Lang's expression didn't change, but Calder saw the subtle tightening around his eyes. "This child," Lang said slowly, "she wouldn't happen to be wearing a bone pendant, would she, carved with the symbols of the chief's bloodline?" Calder met his gaze steadily. "She would." The explosion of voices that followed made the horses sidestep nervously. Tom Hendricks was the loudest, his voice cracking with strain. "Jesus Christ, Calder, do you know what you've done? They'll burn every ranch from here to Santa Fe looking for her." "She's a child," Calder replied, his voice cutting through the shouting. "A hurt child who needed help. I wasn't going to leave her to die in the desert." "Noble sentiments," Lang said, raising his hand for quiet. "But we need to think practically. The Tahué want her back, and they are not in a mood for negotiation. Your best bet is to return her immediately. Hope they see it as a gesture of good faith." "She's too weak to travel," Calder said. "Another day in the desert would kill her." "Better her than all of us," Morrison muttered, earning sharp looks from the others. "That's enough," Lang snapped. "We're not in the business of sacrificing children." He turned back to Calder. "How long before she's strong enough to travel? A few days, maybe. She needs rest, proper food." "We don't have a few days," Hendricks said, pointing toward the northern horizon. "Look!" Dust clouds were rising in the distance, too large and too organized to be wild horses or a cattle drive. Even at this distance, Calder could make out the dark shapes of riders moving with military precision. The Tahué were coming, and they were coming in force. "How long do we have?" Lang asked, shading his eyes against the sun. "Hour, maybe 2, Hendricks replied. "They're moving fast." The group stood in tense silence, each man grappling with the reality of the situation. These were not Eastern politicians or army officers safe behind fort walls. These were men who had chosen to make their lives in a land where the line between civilization and wilderness was measured in heartbeats and gunshots. "I'll talk to them," Calder said finally. "Explain the situation." Lang shook his head. Calder, you're a good man, but you're also a fool if you think Red Elk is going to listen to explanations. His daughter is missing, and you're a white man with her in your house. In his mind, the math is pretty simple. Then what do you suggest? We could make a stand here, Morrison said, his hand moving unconsciously to his sidearm. 6 rifles, good position. We could hold them off until reinforcements arrive. Reinforcements from where? Lang asked. The nearest cavalry patrol is 3 days away. We'd be dead long before they got here. As if summoned by their words, a figure appeared in the doorway of the ranch house. The girl stood there, still wrapped in Calder's blanket, her dark eyes taking in the scene with the same careful attention she'd shown since her arrival. She spoke in her native language, her voice stronger than it had been the night before. What's she saying? Lang asked. I don't know, Calder admitted, but she's looking at that dust cloud like she recognizes it. The girl walked to Calder's side, her small hand finding his. She looked up at him and spoke again, this time in broken English. Father come, angry, scared. The simple words carried more weight than any lengthy explanation. Here was a child who understood the gravity of the situation, who knew that her father's love for her had the potential to ignite a war that would consume everything in its path. Well, Lang said grimly, at least we know she's alive and unharmed. That's something. The dust clouds were closer now, resolving into individual riders. Calder could make out the distinctive silhouettes of Tahuea warriors, their horses moving with the fluid grace of people who had been born in the saddle. At the head of the group rode a figure that commanded attention even at a distance, a man whose presence seemed to bend the very air around him. Red Elk, Hendricks whispered, as if speaking the name too loudly might draw the chief's attention. The Tahuea war party crested the ridge, overlooking Calder's ranch like a wave of shadow and steel. There were more of them than anyone had estimated, at least 100 warriors, possibly more. They spread out in a perfect crescent formation, a tactical display that spoke of military experience and deadly intent. The morning sun caught the steel of rifle barrels and the polished edges of war hatchets, creating a glittering display that was both beautiful and terrifying. Red Elk rode at the center of the formation, and even from a distance, his presence was unmistakable. He was a man in his prime, perhaps 50 years old, with the bearing of someone who had never known defeat. His wolf-hide cloak moved with the rhythm of his horse, and the eagle feathers in his hair caught the wind like banners of war. Gentlemen, Marshal Lang said quietly, I suggest we all keep our weapons holstered. Any aggressive move now would be suicide. The warriors maintained their positions on the ridge, a living reminder of the firepower arrayed against the small group of white men. It was a masterful display of psychological warfare, close enough to demonstrate their overwhelming numbers, far enough to avoid seeming immediately threatening. Red Elk descended alone, his horse picking its way down the slope with careful precision. As he drew closer, Calder could see the grief and rage warring in the chief's dark eyes. This was not a man who had come to negotiate. This was a father who had come to reclaim his child and exact vengeance for whatever wrongs he believed had been committed. The chief stopped his horse 30 feet from the group, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to avoid any sudden movements. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. I am Red Elk, chief of the Tahuea nation. I have come for my daughter. Marshal Lang stepped forward, his hands carefully visible and empty. Chief Red Elk, I am Marshal Lang. We understand your concern for your daughter. She is safe and unharmed. Red Elk's eyes moved past Lang to fix on Calder. You have my daughter. It wasn't a question. Calder felt the weight of that gaze, the way it seemed to strip away all pretense and deception. This was a man who had learned to read truth in the faces of enemies and allies alike. I found her, Calder said simply. She was hurt, alone. I gave her food and shelter. You took her. I saved her. The two men stared at each other across the divide of culture and suspicion. Behind Red Elk, the warriors remained motionless, but Calder could feel their tension like a physical presence. One wrong word, one misinterpreted gesture, and this confrontation would explode into violence. Father! The small voice cut through the tension like a blade. Little Star had stepped out from behind Calder, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She spoke in rapid Tahuea, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness to explain. Red Elk's expression didn't change, but Calder saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps, or the beginning of doubt. The chief dismounted and walked toward his daughter, his movements controlled but urgent. Little Star met him halfway, and for a moment the warrior chief became simply a father embracing his lost child. The reunion was brief but intense, Red Elk's hands checking her for injuries, his voice soft with relief and love. But when he straightened and looked at Calder again, the hardness had returned to his features. My daughter tells me you fed her, cared for her wounds. This is good, but it does not explain why she was alone in the desert, why she came to be on your land. She was running from something, Calder said, or someone. She was scared when I found her. Red Elk's jaw tightened. She was taken from her bed in the night, stolen by men who left no trace except the scent of their horses and the sound of their laughter. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Calder felt the eyes of both groups upon him, measuring his response. He understood now why Red Elk had come with so many warriors, why the chief's rage burned so bright. In his mind, white men had stolen his daughter, and now he had found her in the possession of another white man. The logic was simple and damning. I didn't take her, Calder said. I found her wandering near my stock pens yesterday morning. She was exhausted, sunburned, her feet torn from walking. She'd been traveling for days. Little Star spoke again, her voice stronger now. She pointed to her moccasins, then to the fence line where a strip of fabric still hung from a thorn. She pulled up the sleeve of her dress, showing the scratches and cuts that Calder had cleaned and bandaged. Red Elk examined the evidence his daughter presented, his face unreadable. When he looked up at Calder, some of the hostility had faded from his eyes, replaced by something that might have been confusion. You cleaned her wounds, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, fed her. Yes, gave her your own bed. Calder nodded. Red Elk studied him for a long moment, then walked to the fence line where the fabric hung. He examined it carefully, noting the height of the snag, the way the material had been torn by movement rather than cut by a blade. She came here seeking help, Red Elk said finally, not as a captive but as a refugee. That's how I saw it, Calder agreed. The chief returned to his daughter, kneeling to look into her eyes. They spoke in their native language, her voice earnest and explanatory, his gentle but probing. Whatever she told him seemed to satisfy something in his mind, because when he stood, his posture had changed subtly. My daughter says you showed her kindness when others might have turned her away. This is unexpected. Marshal Lang cleared his throat. Chief, if I may ask, do you have any idea who might have taken your daughter originally? Any enemies who might want to harm your family? Red Elk's expression darkened. There are those among my own people who believe the old ways are not strong enough to face the new world. They seek to provoke war, to use blood to wash away the stain of compromise. He paused, his gaze distant. And there are white men who profit from conflict, who sell guns to young warriors and whisper promises of victory in their ears. The implications of his words settled over the group like a heavy blanket. This was bigger than a single missing child or a misunderstanding between neighbors. This was about the future of an entire region, about whether different peoples could coexist or whether the land would be baptized in blood. We want peace, Lang said, but peace requires trust on both sides. Trust! Red Elk repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. My daughter trusts this man because he showed her mercy when she was vulnerable, but trust between peoples, that is harder to build. Calder found himself speaking before he fully realized what he was going to say. Then maybe we start with what we can do, not what we can't. Red Elk looked at him with sharp interest. Explain. Your daughter was hurt and I helped her. That's simple enough. Maybe trust starts with simple things. And if my enemies use this kindness as proof that I have grown weak, if they say that Red Elk's daughter was saved by a white man because her father could not protect her. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of political reality. Calder understood that this was about more than just the immediate situation. Red Elk's authority, his ability to lead his people through increasingly difficult times, could be undermined by the very act of mercy that had brought them together. Then tell them a different story, Calder said. Tell them that Red Elk's daughter was so well taught in the ways of survival that she was able to find help when she needed it. Tell them that she was smart enough to recognize an ally when she saw one. Little Star spoke up again, her voice carrying a strength that belied her small size. She gestured toward Calder, then toward the ranch house, speaking rapidly in Tahuea. Whatever she was saying seemed to surprise her father because his eyebrows rose slightly. What is she telling you? Lang asked. Red Elk was quiet for a long moment, studying Calder's face with renewed interest. She says that when she was afraid, this man did not try to comfort her with words. He showed her his own sadness, his own losses. She says she saw a picture of his family, people who are no longer with him. Calder felt heat rise in his cheeks. He hadn't realized the girl had noticed the daguerreotype on his mantle, the faded image of his wife and son who had died of fever 7 years ago in Fort Yuma. It was a private grief, one he rarely shared with anyone. She says that people who have known loss understand how precious it is to find something that was lost, Red Elk continued. She says you looked at her the way a father looks at his child. The words hit Calder like a physical blow. He had thought he was simply doing what anyone would do, helping a child in need. But the girl had seen deeper, had recognized something in his actions that he hadn't even acknowledged to himself. I lost my family to disease, Calder said quietly. A long time ago, I couldn't save them. But you saved her, Red Elk said, and in doing so you saved me from a grief I could not have survived. The admission hung between them, a bridge of shared understanding that spanned the divide of culture and suspicion. For a moment, they were simply two men who had known loss and recognized the value of what remained. But the moment was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A young warrior was riding hard toward them, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. He spoke rapidly to Red Elk in their native language, his words urgent and troubled. Red Elk's expression darkened as he listened. When the messenger finished, the chief turned to address the group, his voice heavy with new concern. Ghost Hawk, one of my war leaders, comes from the north. He says he has found the tracks of those who took my daughter. He says they lead to a camp where white men and young Tahuea warriors meet in secret. The implications were staggering. If Red Elk was right, if there were indeed people on both sides working to provoke conflict, then Little Star's kidnapping had been intended as the spark that would ignite a war. These conspirators, Lang said, they would have expected you to find your daughter here in the possession of a white man. Yes, Red Elk agreed. They would have expected me to kill him, to take revenge that would demand counter-revenge, blood calling to blood until the whole territory burned. Calder felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had been used, manipulated by people who saw his compassion as a weakness to be exploited. The girl had been delivered to his doorstep not by accident, but by design. But their plan failed, he said, because your daughter is smarter than they gave her credit for. And because you chose mercy over suspicion, Red Elk replied. This is unexpected. The sound of more riders approaching interrupted their conversation. Ghost Hawk had arrived with a small group of warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons ready. The young war leader was perhaps 25 years old, with the fierce intensity of someone who had known too much conflict in too few years. He spoke rapidly to Red Elk, his words sharp with anger and frustration. Even without understanding the language, Calder could hear the disagreement in their voices. Ghost Hawk kept pointing at the white men, his gestures aggressive and demanding. "What's he saying?" Lang asked. Red Elk's jaw tightened. "He says that regardless of how my daughter came to be here, the fact remains that she was found among white men. He says that to let this pass without consequence would be seen as weakness, that other chiefs would question my ability to protect my people." "And what do you say to that?" "I say that wisdom sometimes requires us to choose the harder path over the easier one." Ghost Hawk's voice rose, his words becoming more heated. Other warriors began to murmur among themselves, some nodding in agreement with their war leader. Calder could see the political dynamics at play, the way that Red Elk's authority was being challenged by those who saw any compromise as betrayal. Little Star stepped forward then, her small voice cutting through the argument. She spoke in Tahuea, her words clear and strong despite her youth. Whatever she was saying seemed to surprise the warriors because the murmuring stopped and all eyes turned to her. "What is she saying?" Calder asked. Red Elk's expression was unreadable. "She is reminding them of the old stories, of the teaching that says true strength is shown not in the striking of blows, but in the staying of hands that could strike." Ghost Hawk responded angrily, his words quick and sharp. Little Star listened calmly, then replied with something that made several of the warriors shift uncomfortably. Even Ghost Hawk seemed taken aback by her response. She asks him whether he would prefer to be known as a warrior who fought for his people's future, or as one who threw away that future for the sake of his own pride. Red Elk translated. "She says that the men who took her are laughing now, watching us argue among ourselves while they prepare their next move." The political implications were clear. If Red Elk's people spent their energy fighting with the white settlers, they would be weakened and vulnerable to whatever larger scheme was unfolding. But if they could find a way to work together, they might be able to identify and stop the real conspirators. "Chief," Marshal Lang said carefully, "if there are people on both sides working to start a war, then they're enemies to both of us. Maybe it's time we started treating them that way." Red Elk considered this, his gaze moving from face to face among the white men. "You would fight beside us, against your own people, Against people who profit from conflict and misery, Lang replied. People who would use a child as a pawn in their games. Yes, I would fight against people like that. The other ranchers nodded their agreement, though Calder could see the uncertainty in their eyes. These were men who had come west to build new lives, not to involve themselves in the complex politics of territorial conflicts. But they were also men who understood the value of community, of standing together against common threats. Ghost Hawk spoke again, his voice calmer now but still skeptical. Red Elk listened, then turned to address the group. Ghost Hawk asks how we can trust men we do not know, how we can fight beside people whose ways are foreign to us. Same way you trust anyone, Calder said, one choice at a time. Red Elk studied him for a long moment. You speak of trust as if it were a luxury we can afford. I speak of trust as if it were the only thing we can afford, Calder replied, because the alternative is exactly what our enemies want. The chief was quiet for a long time, his eyes distant as he weighed the possibilities. Around them, the two groups of men, White and Tahuea, waited for his decision. The future of the territory might well hang in the balance of his next words. There is an old saying among my people, Red Elk said finally, that a man's true character is revealed not in times of plenty, but in times of scarcity, not in times of peace, but in times of war. He gestured toward Calder. This man's character was revealed when he found my daughter. He chose to help rather than to harm, to heal rather than to use. This is the character of a man who could be trusted. Ghost Hawk spoke up, his voice respectful but firm. Red Elk listened, then nodded slowly. Ghost Hawk reminds me that trust must be earned by actions, not just words. He proposes a test of this alliance. What kind of test? Lang asked. The tracks he found lead to a canyon 20 miles north of here. If white men and Tahuea conspirators are meeting there, they must be stopped. But it will require warriors who can work together, who can trust each other in battle. The proposal hung in the air like a challenge. This was more than just an alliance of convenience. It was a test of whether two very different peoples could truly cooperate when their lives depended on it. How many men are we talking about? Calder asked. Unknown, Red Elk replied. But Ghost Hawk believes there are at least 30, perhaps more. They have chosen their meeting place well. The canyon has only one way in and one way out. Anyone who enters will be trapped if the entrance is blocked. Sounds like a job for people who know how to work together, Lang said grimly. Red Elk nodded. We will need men who can move quietly, who can coordinate their actions without words. It will require trust of the deepest kind. Little Star spoke up then, her voice carrying an authority that seemed remarkable for someone so young. She gestured toward the north, toward the canyon where the conspirators waited, then looked directly at her father. What is she saying? Calder asked. She says that the men who took her spoke of a great fire that would cleanse the land, that would drive out all who refused to choose sides. She says they plan to attack settlements and tribal camps alike, to create so much fear and hatred that war becomes inevitable. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. This wasn't simply about local conflicts or territorial disputes. Someone was orchestrating a campaign of terror designed to destroy any possibility of coexistence between the peoples of the territory. When? Lang asked. Soon, Red Elk replied. Ghost Hawk heard them speak of the new moon when the darkness would hide their movements. That is 3 days from now. 3 days to organize an alliance between former enemies, to plan and execute a mission that would require perfect coordination and absolute trust. 3 days to prevent a war that could consume the entire territory. We'll need to move fast, Calder said, and we'll need to be smart about it. Red Elk nodded. Ghost Hawk will guide us to the canyon, but I want you to understand, once we begin this path, there is no turning back. If we fail, if we are discovered, the consequences will be severe for all of us. And if we succeed, Lang asked, if we succeed, we will have earned something more valuable than victory. We will have earned the beginning of trust. The two groups began to merge then, as practical considerations overcame cultural barriers. Maps were drawn in the dirt, weapons were checked, and plans were made with the quiet efficiency of men who understood that their lives might depend on the decisions made in the next few hours. Little Star remained close to her father, but Calder noticed that she often looked in his direction, as if seeking reassurance that he would be part of whatever came next. The connection between them had been forged in a moment of crisis, but it seemed to be deepening into something more lasting. She likes you, Red Elk observed during a quiet moment. She's a brave girl, Calder replied. Braver than most adults I know. Yes, but also wise. She sees things that others miss. What kind of things? Red Elk was quiet for a moment, watching his daughter as she spoke with some of the younger warriors. She sees that the old ways and the new ways do not have to be enemies, that there is strength in adaptation, in learning from others. And what do you see? I see a man who has known loss and chosen to prevent it in others. I see someone who could be trusted with the safety of my people. The words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning. Calder understood that Red Elk was offering him something more than just temporary cooperation. He was offering him a place in a larger community, a chance to belong to something greater than his own solitary existence. I appreciate that, Calder said, but I'm just a rancher. I don't know anything about politics or leadership. Leadership is not about knowing everything, Red Elk replied. It is about making the right choices when the knowledge is incomplete. You have already shown that quality. The afternoon passed in preparation and planning. The mixed group of white and Tahuea men worked together with surprising harmony, their shared purpose overcoming cultural differences. Calder found himself paired with a warrior named Swift Arrow, a man about his own age who spoke enough English to communicate effectively. As they prepared their weapons and checked their supplies, Swift Arrow asked him a question that cut to the heart of the matter. Why do you do this? Why risk your life for people you do not know? Calder considered the question carefully. Because some things are worth the risk. Because if we don't stop these people, a lot of innocent folks are going to die. But why do you care? These are not your people, not your land. Maybe they are, Calder said. Maybe we're all just people trying to make a life in a hard place. Maybe the differences aren't as big as we think they are. Swift Arrow studied him for a long moment. You talk like a wise man, but wisdom and survival are not always the same thing. No, Calder agreed, but sometimes they are. As evening approached, the combined force prepared to move out. 20 men in total, 10 white, 10 Tahuea, armed and ready to face whatever waited in the canyon. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. They would approach the canyon from 2 directions, coordinate their assault, and capture or eliminate the conspirators before they could escape. Red Elk addressed the group before they departed, his words translated by Little Star for the benefit of the white men. He says that tonight we fight not as white men or as Tahuea, but as people who choose the future over the past, hope over fear, she translated. He says that whatever happens, we will face it together. The ride north was conducted in tense silence, 20 men moving through the desert night like ghosts. The moon was nearly dark, providing the cover they needed, but making navigation treacherous. Ghost Hawk led the way, his knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable as they navigated around rocky outcrops and deep arroyos that could have broken a horse's leg. Calder found himself riding beside Swift Arrow, their horses matching pace in the darkness. The Tahuea warrior had proven to be a skilled tactician during their planning sessions, and Calder had come to respect his quiet competence. As they rode, Swift Arrow spoke in low tones about the terrain ahead, the likely positions of sentries, and the best approaches to the canyon. The entrance is narrow, Swift Arrow explained, his English careful but clear, perhaps 20 feet across, high walls on both sides. If they have guards, they will be positioned on the rim watching the approach. How do we deal with that? Calder asked. Ghost Hawk knows another way, a path that leads to the top of the canyon, very dangerous, but it will put us behind their sentries. The plan was beginning to take shape in Calder's mind. A small group would scale the canyon walls to neutralize any guards, while the main force would approach from the front once the sentries were eliminated. It was risky, requiring precise timing and absolute trust between men who had been enemies just hours before. They reached the vicinity of the canyon just after midnight. Ghost Hawk called a halt, and the group dismounted, leaving their horses with 2 men who would serve as a rear guard. The rest moved forward on foot, their weapons ready but their movements careful and quiet. The canyon entrance loomed before them like a wound in the earth, its walls rising into darkness. Even from a distance, Calder could see the faint glow of firelight from within, evidence that their intelligence had been correct. The conspirators were indeed meeting here, hidden from casual observation, but not from those who knew where to look. Red Elk gathered the group for final instructions, his voice barely above a whisper. Remember, we want prisoners if possible. Dead men cannot tell us about others who might be involved in this conspiracy. Ghost Hawk pointed to the canyon walls. I will take 3 men up the north wall. Swift Arrow will take 3 up the south wall. When the sentries are eliminated, we will signal with the call of a night bird. Then the main force advances. Calder found himself assigned to Ghost Hawk's group, along with Marshal Lang and a young rancher named Pete Morrison. The climb was treacherous, requiring them to move slowly and carefully up a narrow trail that seemed to have been carved by wind and water over countless centuries. Halfway up, they encountered the first sentry. The man was positioned behind a boulder, his rifle trained on the canyon entrance below. He was young, perhaps 20 years old, with the soft features of someone who had never known real hardship. Ghost Hawk moved like a shadow, approaching from behind with a skill that spoke of years of training. The sentry was unconscious before he could cry out. Ghost Hawk's blow calculated to disable rather than kill. They bound and gagged him, then continued their ascent. At the top of the canyon, they found 2 more guards, both white men who were more interested in their whispered conversation than in watching for intruders. The coordination between Ghost Hawk and Calder was wordless and perfect. They moved simultaneously, each taking one of the guards, their actions synchronized by instinct and necessity. Within moments, both sentries were neutralized, their weapons confiscated. From their position on the canyon rim, Calder could see into the valley below. The sight that greeted him was worse than he had imagined. At least 40 men were gathered around multiple fires, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. But what made his blood run cold was the diversity of the group, white men and Tahuea warriors standing together, united in their desire for conflict. "Jesus," Marshal Lang whispered beside him, "there are more of them than we thought." Ghost Hawk was studying the scene with professional interest. "They have weapons, many weapons, more than they would need for hunting or defense." Indeed, Calder could see stacks of rifles, boxes of ammunition, and what appeared to be barrels of gunpowder. This wasn't just a meeting of conspirators, it was an arsenal being prepared for war. At the center of the group stood a man Calder recognized, Colonel Marcus Webb, a former army officer who had been cashiered from service for selling weapons to hostile tribes. Beside him stood a Tahuea warrior whose scarred face and aggressive posture marked him as a war leader. They were addressing the assembled group, their words carrying clearly in the still night air. "Tomorrow night we strike simultaneously," Webb was saying. "The Morrison Ranch, the Hendricks Place, and the Tahuea Winter Camp. By dawn there will be blood on both sides and no possibility of peace." "And then?" the scarred warrior asked. "Then we watch them tear each other apart while we supply weapons to both sides. There's more money to be made in war than in peace, and more power to be gained in chaos than in order." The casual brutality of their plan was staggering. These men were prepared to destroy entire communities for the sake of profit and power. Calder felt a cold rage building in his chest, the same feeling he had known during the war when faced with men who treated human life as a commodity. Ghost Hawk made the signal, a perfect imitation of a night bird's call. From across the canyon, Swift Arrow responded with the same call. The sentries were eliminated, and the main force could advance. But as they prepared to descend into the canyon, Calder realized that their original plan was no longer adequate. With 40 men below instead of the expected 30, they were outnumbered 2-1. A direct assault would be suicide. "We need a new plan," he whispered to Ghost Hawk. The young war leader nodded, his mind already working on the problem. "The weapons! If we can reach the weapons before they do, we can control the battle." It was a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. Ghost Hawk signaled to Swift Arrow's group, using a series of hand gestures that conveyed the changed situation. The response came quickly. Swift Arrow understood and was ready to adapt. The new plan was simple but dangerous. While the main force created a distraction at the canyon entrance, the men on the rim would descend into the camp and secure the weapons. It would require perfect timing and more than a little luck. Red Elk's voice echoed from the canyon entrance, amplified by the narrow walls. "Marcus Webb, you are surrounded. Surrender now and you will be treated fairly." The reaction below was immediate and violent. Men scattered for cover, reaching for weapons, shouting orders and curses. But in the chaos, Calder saw an opportunity. Most of the conspirators were focused on the entrance, leaving the weapons relatively unguarded. "Now," Ghost Hawk whispered, and they began their descent. The climb down was even more treacherous than the ascent, made worse by the need for speed. Calder's boots slipped on loose rock, and he had to grab for handholds that crumbled under his weight. Behind him, Marshal Lang was breathing hard, his face pale with exertion and fear. They reached the canyon floor just as the first shots were fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing off the walls like thunder. Calder could see muzzle flashes from both ends of the canyon as the two forces engaged. Ghost Hawk led them toward the weapon's cache, moving with the fluid grace of a natural warrior. They were almost there when a shout rang out behind them. One of the conspirators had spotted their movement and was raising his rifle. Calder spun and fired, his shot taking the man in the shoulder and spinning him around. The wounded conspirator's shot went wide, but the sound had alerted others to their presence. Suddenly, they were in the middle of a firefight, caught between the main battle and the men guarding the weapons. "Cover me!" Ghost Hawk shouted and sprinted toward the ammunition boxes. Calder and Lang provided covering fire, their shots forcing the conspirators to take cover. Ghost Hawk reached the weapons cache and began throwing rifles to his allies, turning the tide of the battle. With superior firepower in the hands of Red Elk's men, the outcome was no longer in doubt, but Marcus Webb wasn't finished. The former colonel had rallied a group of his most loyal followers and was making a fighting retreat toward the far end of the canyon. If he escaped, he could continue his schemes elsewhere, potentially starting the very war they were trying to prevent. "He's getting away!" Lang shouted over the gunfire. Calder made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Leaving the relative safety of the weapons cache, he pursued Webb and his men, Ghost Hawk and two other warriors following close behind. The chase led them through the maze of boulders and shadows that littered the canyon floor. They caught up with Webb near the far end of the canyon, where the walls narrowed to barely 10 feet across. The former colonel had taken position behind a fallen boulder, his remaining men spread out in a defensive line. He was trapped, but he was also dangerous, a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. "It's over, Webb," Calder called out. "Surrender now, and you might live to see trial." Webb's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. "You think you've won something here? You think stopping me will change anything? There are others, Boone, others who understand that this territory isn't big enough for both our peoples." "Maybe not," Calder replied, "but we're going to try to make it work anyway." "Naive fool, you can't change human nature. You can't make wolves lie down with sheep." "Maybe not, but we can choose not to be wolves." The philosophical debate was interrupted by gunfire. Webb's men had decided to make their last stand, and the canyon erupted in violence once again. In the chaos that followed, Calder lost sight of Webb himself, focusing instead on the immediate threat of the men shooting at him. When the smoke cleared, 5 of the conspirators lay dead, 3 were wounded, and Webb himself was nowhere to be found. A careful search revealed a narrow crack in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He had escaped, but alone and on foot in hostile territory. "He won't get far," Ghost Hawk said grimly. "The desert does not forgive men who travel without preparation." Perhaps he was right, but Calder couldn't shake the feeling that they had missed something important. Webb had been too confident, too sure of himself even in defeat. It was possible that he had other allies, other plans that hadn't been discussed at the meeting. The surviving conspirators were bound and guarded while the battlefield was secured. The weapons cache was enormous, enough arms and ammunition to supply a small army. It was clear that Webb and his allies had been planning something far more ambitious than a few isolated attacks. As dawn broke over the canyon, Red Elk and his men began the grim task of identifying the dead and wounded. The conspirators had included men from both cultures, united in their desire for conflict. Some were known troublemakers, men who had been causing problems for months. Others were surprising, respected members of their communities who had apparently been seduced by promises of easy money or misguided notions of racial superiority. "What do we do with the prisoners?" Lang asked. Red Elk considered the question carefully. "The white men will be turned over to your authorities. The Tahuea will face our justice. But first, they will tell us everything they know about this conspiracy." The interrogations that followed revealed the full scope of the plot. Webb had been working with allies in Santa Fe and even Washington, men who stood to profit from territorial conflicts. The plan had been to create a series of incidents that would escalate into full-scale war, driving out the moderate voices on both sides and leaving the field clear for those who profited from chaos. "It's bigger than we thought," Lang said as they prepared to leave the canyon. "This goes all the way to the territorial government. Then we will have to be careful about who we trust," Red Elk replied. "But we have proven that cooperation is possible. Perhaps that is enough to begin with." The journey back to Calder's ranch was subdued. The men were exhausted, both physically and emotionally drained by the night's events. But there was also a sense of accomplishment, a feeling that they had prevented something terrible from happening. Little Star was waiting for them when they arrived, her face bright with relief at seeing her father safe. She ran to embrace him, then surprised Calder by doing the same for him. The gesture was simple but profound, a child's acceptance that transcended cultural barriers. "What happens now?" Calder asked Red Elk as they stood watching the sunrise. "Now we build," the chief replied. "We build trust one choice at a time. We build understanding one conversation at a time. We build a future that our children can inherit with pride." It was an ambitious goal, perhaps even an impossible one. But as Calder looked around at the mixed group of men who had fought together in the canyon, he began to believe that it might be possible after all. The months that followed were difficult but productive. The conspiracy trials in Santa Fe exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of the territorial government. Several officials were removed from office, and new policies were implemented to protect the rights of all residents, regardless of their heritage. Calder's ranch became an unofficial meeting place for representatives of both communities. His kitchen table hosted discussions that ranged from water rights to trade agreements, from legal disputes to cultural exchanges. It wasn't always easy. Old prejudices died hard, and there were setbacks and disappointments along the way. But gradually something new began to emerge, a community that encompassed both peoples, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. It wasn't the old West of legend, where conflicts were settled with guns and might made right. It was something quieter but more enduring, a place where differences were acknowledged but not allowed to define relationships. Little Star became a bridge between the two worlds, her natural intelligence and cultural fluency making her an invaluable translator and mediator. She spent part of her time at the Tahuea winter camp, learning the traditional ways of her people, and part at Calder's ranch, where she absorbed the practical skills of frontier life. Under her influence, Calder began to see his role differently. He was no longer just a solitary rancher trying to make a living in a hard land. He was part of something larger, a community that depended on him as much as he depended on it. It was a responsibility he had never sought, but one that gave his life a meaning it had lacked since the death of his family. The ranch grew and prospered, but not just economically. It became known throughout the territory as a place where conflicts could be resolved peacefully, where people of different backgrounds could find common ground. Travelers would arrive with stories of its reputation, and many stayed to become part of the growing community. Years passed, and the harsh desert gradually gave way to irrigated fields and thriving settlements. The railroad came through, bringing new opportunities and new challenges. The territorial government evolved, becoming more responsive to the needs of all its citizens. The fears that had once seemed so overwhelming, the threat of war, the impossibility of coexistence, began to fade into memory. Calder aged gracefully, his hair turning silver and his face acquiring the deep lines that came from years of desert sun and wind. He never remarried, but he was never alone. The community that had grown around his ranch became his family, and he became its unofficial patriarch. Little Star grew into a remarkable young woman, her intelligence and compassion making her a natural leader. She married a young lawyer from Santa Fe, a man who shared her vision of a territory where justice was colorblind and opportunity was available to all. Together, they continued the work of building bridges between communities. Red Elk lived to see his grandchildren playing freely in a world where their mixed heritage was a source of strength rather than conflict. He and Calder became close friends, their relationship deepening over the years into something approaching brotherhood. They would sit on Calder's porch in the evenings, two old men sharing stories and watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. When Calder finally passed away, it was in his sleep, surrounded by the community he had helped to build. The funeral was unlike anything the territory had ever seen. Hundreds of people of all backgrounds coming together to honor a man who had chosen kindness over fear, understanding over prejudice. Little Star, now a mature woman with children of her own, carved his headstone with the words that best captured his legacy. He chose kindness when others chose fear. But she added something else, a line in both English and Tahuea that translated to Father of Many Nations. The ranch continued to thrive under new ownership, but it retained its character as a place where people could find healing and hope. It became known as Whispering Hollow, a name that reflected its role as a place where quiet conversations could change the world. And in the growing towns and cities of the territory, in the schools where children of all backgrounds learned together, in the courts where justice was administered fairly, in the businesses where success was measured by merit rather than ancestry, the legacy of those difficult early days lived on. It was a legacy built not on grand gestures or dramatic battles, but on the simple recognition that people, all people, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The story of Calder Boone and Little Star became part of the territory's folklore, passed down through generations as an example of what was possible when good people chose to do the right thing, even when it was difficult. It wasn't a perfect world they had created. There were still problems, still prejudices, still conflicts to be resolved. But it was a world where such problems could be addressed through dialogue rather than violence, where the future was shaped by hope rather than fear. And in the end, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all, the knowledge that even in the hardest of times, in the most challenging of circumstances, the human capacity for compassion and understanding could triumph over hatred and division. It was a lesson that would echo through the generations, a reminder that the choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances could change the world. The desert wind still blew across the land, carrying with it the dust of ages and the promise of tomorrow. But it also carried something else, the whisper of voices long silenced, the echo of choices made with courage and wisdom, the enduring hope that someday, somehow, all of humanity might learn to live together in peace. In the end, that was the true legacy of Whispering Hollow, not just a successful ranch or a thriving community, but a living proof that the divisions that seemed so insurmountable could be bridged by those brave enough to try. It was a legacy written not in stone or steel, but in the hearts and minds of all who had been touched by the simple truth that kindness, more than any weapon, had the power to change the world.